The second part of the podcast starts with me asking Dr. Schaffer about two critical leadership capabilities, that being strategic thinking and foresight. And you'll find her response quite an interesting one. Again, thanks for joining me for the second part of this podcast. Again, thank you for all your support, and I will catch you all on the next podcast.
I think it's a suite of things. So whilst they are useful skills, absolutely they are, but they need to be coupled with compassion and courage and honesty and trustworthiness and focus and flexibility and resilience and vision and responsibility and respect. Woo! You know, there's lots of other things. So I don't know that it's one skill. I don't know that I would say, I think sometimes, you mentioned before about leaders are different in different sectors. I'm not sure I agree with that. I tend to think that there are some core things. People with empathy, compassion. When you look at the Prime Minister of New Zealand, you know, Jacinda Ardern, you see a different kind of leader, but at the core of who she is, she brings compassion, she brings strategic thinking, she brings foresight, she brings an ability to look at a situation, weigh it up, and try and move forward in such a way that it's going to make people want to follow, but also make them feel good about the decision that's been made as well. So I think, yes, it's good. They're good things to have. But I think it's got to be more than that. If you are just a strategic thinker and you just have foresight, that's great, but I'm not quite sure that you'd be a leader.
Part of the research process for me is I could have looked at a lot of other leadership capabilities, but in wanting to get this done in a certain amount of time, you've got to focus on some things. And I think for me, these stood out. And if I had it to do again, which I'm not going to start again, but into the future, if I was going to map out what I thought were the suite of those skills, I think, yeah, everything that you mentioned needs to be part of the toolkit. But for me, and I guess I can only prove this by more research into the future, which I think I will be doing, is that, yes, you need all those things that you mentioned, but without strategic thinking and foresight, I don't think you would be as effective a leader if you didn't have those things. So if you weren't a good strategic thinker, let's leave foresight out of this for just a second, and if we just looked at strategic thinking, if you had all those other things, but you couldn't think strategically, or at least in the role to get that role moving, I don't think you would be as effective as someone who had all those things that you mentioned, plus an ability to think at that macro level. And I'm not saying everyone can't do it, because in terms of a cognitive process, everyone can think strategically, but I think leaders differentiate themselves to some degree by being able to think at a macro level and see the connections on things. I think everyone can do that, but the better leaders do that better. The more effective leaders do that better. I'm trying to be careful with the wording I use here, because again, and please disagree if you disagree, but I'm just seeing that from at least the lens of the world of work that I'm in at the moment now. I'll always take a critique and go, maybe I'm wrong with this, but I think as my research expands into the future and look at other industries, I don't think I'm far off the mark that, yes, you need all those things that you mentioned, but if you don't have the capacity to think strategically to the degree that it might be needed in your industry, you won't be as effective as the next person who's got that capability.
I'm a big picture thinker. There's no two ways about it. I love working with others because I love to be up here. You know, I love to be thinking about all the different connections. I call it a win-win-win-win. So I'm always thinking, okay, if we do it that way, we'll get a win. If we do it this way, we'll get a win-win. If we combine those two things, we'll get a win-win-win. You know, I really like to do that and I enjoy that. But I also need those strategic thinkers who are at a different level to me, because I need them to keep me on track sometimes, because I get a bit carried away with my big picture thinking And then they'll come along and say, well, Vic, technology is a good one. So you're going down this path, you've got these fantastic ideas, you know that it's going to be, have all these really great outcomes. And then I need those folks to come along and say, well, actually, you can't do that because the technology at this point can only do X, Y, and Z. And so they're specialist strategic thinkers, whereas I tend to look across the board at a multidisciplinary approach. So from multiple areas, from industry, from the students, from, academia, from, management, marketing. Tourism has all of that. So it gives me the opportunity to play in a very big space.
Sure.
But I need those specialist thinkers to say, well, actually, have you thought about doing this way? And then I add that little piece to the puzzle that I'm working on, and then we can really move something forward. So I think it's an important skill not only for leaders but also for managers, and I think it's important at multiple levels.
I've never gone into this thinking that, yes, you can only have one strategic thinker, and I guess the most effective leaders gather those with skill sets around them to test your own thinking. And yeah, I never viewed it as the one person doing it. And if I sounded like that, it wasn't what I was intending to convey. So okay, let's use a typical example. In an organizational setting, I would hope that if I had 1,000 staff, that I could foster amongst those that have been identified as managers and leaders in their own right, could be in a room with me and test my assumptions about things, because the best kind of strategy, although in the literature they talk about the existing strategy versus the emerging strategy, that getting to that really deep level stuff is stuff that I would encourage my colleagues to bring up. And people that I think in the world that have done that and made it an art form are people like the late Steve Jobs, people in the IT sector, the gurus like your Elon Musk of the world. I mean, he's more than IT, but that kind of person, your Bill Gates, they get the smartest people they can in the room and go, I'm not the smartest person in the room, but I've got some ideas. Tell me why it's good. Tell me where it's bad. And we get an even better idea. And so, I think, and again, I don't have research proof to back me on this, but one of the things that I think intuitively from my work experience is that if you can't access the thinking of others to test your own, then that says something about you as a strategic thinker, let alone applying things like foresight and those other skills that you talked about. Because in roles, and let's move away maybe from those capabilities, things like ethical leadership, empathic leadership, being a good communicator. If I can't tell you what I'm thinking, whether it's strategic or not, and you don't get the communication from me, I haven't done my job as a leader either. If I can't talk to you, or you can't talk back at me, and we can't have a dialogue or dialectic and challenge each other's thinking, then it goes nowhere. So, no, fully on board. And I guess I think the word in academia is delimiting my study. So I could look at 1,000 things, but I'd never get the damn paper written. So I've had to focus, and I'm looking forward to being tested on this in the world of academia from those that when my thesis is published, for what it's worth, when people read it, to say, yeah, agree, but maybe there's some other things, and those will open up other areas of inquiry. And I think if I take something away from this podcast, and for those listening, I think if you're listening to what Vikki's saying, is that you need to have a suite of tools in that leadership kit, and I think that's very important. So thank you again for raising that, raising the nuances there, Vikki, because it is leadership is a big area, and it's not one or two capabilities, obviously. So look, we're at the end of the podcast, and I have one more question to ask you, and I'm sure you'll laugh out loud when I ask this, but I'm not saying this to be, I'm not being rude when I ask this, but what might you say to a younger version of yourself about being an effective leader, Vikki?
So they're just little punchy responses, really. It's really to say,
okay, that's fine, no worries.
It'll all work out in the end. Enjoy the journey. Be yourself. Don't be afraid to show that you care. Everyone makes mistakes, but don't let them define you, and learn from them as well. That's really important. Have a go. Try everything, even if it really scares you. Sing, dance, laugh, bring it all to the table.
Mate, that is a very fantastic, positive way to end the podcast. And Vikki, this has been a very, very interesting podcast, and I really thank you quite profoundly for sharing your learnings on this stuff. And I've now got a better platform to take these podcasts to other academics around the place, because I've always wondered, could I sort of get into this field and talk to people like yourself about this leadership question, because often you're so entrenched in the work that you're doing that you might not be thinking about this as a topic of interest. And now we've had a good 40 minutes plus talking about this, and I've probably learned a lot more than you in this process. And for those listening, I think this is one of the podcasts you need to listen to around someone's experience of leadership, particularly from an academic viewpoint. So those listening, I've been talking to Vikki Schaffer, a senior lecturer in the tourism part of the business school of the University of the Sunshine Coast. Vikki, thank you for your time.
Oh, thanks, Eric. It was fun.
For those listening, this has been Talking Leadership. I'm your podcast host, Eric Perez, thanking you for your time.